Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Sunday evening Shabbat Hagadol Drasha. The title of the topic I chose for this year is Minhag, consecration of custom or tyranny of tradition. Which one is a minhag? Is a minhag a rigid routine or is it a holy habit? And I wanted to talk about the place of Minhagim in Halacha and in Judaism in general. And I deliberately used as the subtitle, not just the place of Minhagim in Halacha, but also in Judaism more broadly speaking. Now, it's obviously somewhat ironic that this shir is being given as a Shabbat Hagadol Drasha on a Sunday evening in a rather untraditional and unminhag-like format. But nonetheless, I think it's a topic that deserves discussion. It's an absolutely fascinating subject. The place of Minhag in Halacha, the place of Minhag in Judaism, what is the role of custom and tradition? These are really very important matters. And the Shabbat Hagadol Drasha always explores a broader topic, but one also that has a link to Pesach. And there's no Chag, there's no Yom Tov, there's no time of year where Minhag is as significant and important as Pesach. So many Minhagim, so many customs around how we clean and prepare our houses for Pesach, what goods and what products we eat and don't eat, the standards of kashering, the hechsherim, gebrach, soft Sephardi matzahs, matzah shira, egg matzahs, kitnios, so many areas where Minhag is discussed around Pesach. And indeed, in running my Pesach WhatsApp groups and Paskin and Shilas for Pesach, again and again I've been asked, what exactly is the place of Minhag in Pesach? And I have an almost standard text that I will often write in response to a question, in which I'll say, many have the Minhag to do X, or the Minhag is Y, but the core halacha is Z. And again, this is a shorthand formula in which I'm attempting to convey a complicated halachic point in the brevity that a WhatsApp or text response demands. But I thought it made sense this year to explore this a little further and try and understand in greater depth what's really going on with Minhagim. This is also, in a sense, a continuation of my Sunday morning shiurim, because we've spent now about half a year looking at first the authority of the written Torah, Torah Shvichsav, then the authority of the oral Torah, Torah Shebal Peh, and then we moved on to Das Torah, the concept, the controversial concept of Das Torah, the role of rabbinic authority in general. And Minhag fits nicely into that series in the sense of understanding the role and nature of communal authority and rabbinic authority, as we will see shortly. So in some respects, this is a continuation of those Sunday morning shiurim, which are all available incidentally on our Nair YouTube channel for those who want to listen to them. This is also a freestanding topic. What exactly is the role of Minhag? I will revisit this at the end, but it is clear that beyond halacha, there are other modes of operation, ways of behaving, which are appropriate for Jews. And interestingly, in the words of the famous Chazal, the Jewish people merited their redemption from Egypt because lo shinu l'shonom, they didn't change their language, malbushom, their clothing, and shemom, their names. Now, none of these matters are items of strict halacha. There are no technical halachas about what names we can be called, what language we need to speak, and what clothing we need to wear beyond the tzitzis and perhaps the parameters of tznius. Nonetheless, these were the sources and reasons through which we merited to leave Egypt according to one particular chazal. So Minhag and the concept of Minhag is an important one associated with this time of year in many different respects, and one that is worth exploring and really needs to be understood. And I have to tell you, it's a fascinating subject, a truly vast topic. There's thousands of Minhagim out there. Every town in Germany and every village in Afghanistan had its own Minhagim. Certainly the format of this evening will not be to list Minhagim, which are near endless, and go through and explain their origins and their basis. There are a number of encyclopedic works written around the topic of Minhagim that explore Minhag on many different levels, from the traditional to the academic, Rabbi Sperber's work, Hasidic works on the subject, a vast array, some of which I tapped into and used in preparing this year. But in essence, this year is not an attempt to explain any particular minhag, including the minhagim around Pesach. I will touch upon gebroks or kitnius, but I'm not going to explore them in any great depth. It's rather more to look holistically at the concept of minhag. And the truth is, when one learns this subject, it's a world tour. It's not just a tour of Torah, but it's really also a tour of Jewish history and geography. And as one uncovers minhag and tries to understand where they come from and what they're about, it's almost like an archaeological dig in which one peels off layer by layer the origins of the minhag and how it developed and how it evolved, and explores where this arose from and where it came from. And therefore, this is a topic well beyond what can really be discussed in the time available this evening. But I hope I will manage to reference some of the main ideas around what a minhag is and where it derives its force from. Now, initially when I was planning the shir, I thought I would at this stage go straight into looking at some of the sources that discuss minhag and explain its role in halacha and in Judaism more generally. And it quickly became apparent to me that this was not a reasonable format for the shir, because actually the meaning of the word minhag is a little unclear. And this is really part of the problem. Part of the problem over here is that minhag is used in so many different ways and so many different contexts. That's a lot of a confusion around the subject, is that we use the term minhag for everything ranging from very serious and important halachas, like chibut ha'arava, the hitting of the arava on Hoshana Rabbah, or like the halachas of mourning over the 3 weeks and the 9 days. And we also use it for gefilte fish on Friday night. So we use the word minhag for a wide range of terms and practices, some of which really have very little weight in halacha beyond just being Jewish culture, which is important, and others which are really absolute halacha. And very often I'm asked, is this a halacha or is this a minhag? And it's not always easy to answer that question. And sometimes I struggle to answer it because the dividing line between the two is not as digital, is not as black and white as one might think. And often, actually, the answer is yes. It is both a minhag and halacha, and the balance between the two is not at all clear. So, I think it makes sense. The first stage is to talk about what actually we mean by minhag and what the different uses of the terms are. And I hope, as we unpick this subject and explore a little further what we mean by minhag, perhaps it will become clearer what exactly is meant around this terminology. Now, what is the status of minhag? Was there a divide around this issue throughout Jewish history? And I want to start off by debunking what I think is a myth. One will often hear in Torah circles and in academic circles an argument being put forward that there's a very different approach, for example, between the Sephardi world and the Ashkenazi world as to the authority of minhag and perhaps in general the approach to chumrah. And this is not correct. It is true that if one looks at particular areas of halacha, certain dimensions, for example, of kashering and Pesach, or basar b'chalov, milk and meat when it comes to kashrus, one can spot a pattern in which, for example, the Ashkenazi world takes minhag and chumrah more seriously and the Sephardi world less so. But in general, these statements are made as a reflection perhaps of people who are focused on the core rabbinic text for which one gets semicha, which involves basar b'chalov and kashering and the like. But if one looks beyond that at other areas of halacha, bishul akum, or warming up on Shabbos, or treifus, one finds actually sometimes the opposite pattern emerges, in which the Sephardi world pays greater attention to Chumrah, greater attention to Minhag, and therefore there isn't a simplistic divide between communities in that way. In addition, one doesn't find a clear-cut and unanimous consensus amongst the Rishonim about this point. And I'll give a couple of examples which I've seen quoted, where there's almost a internal contradiction in the ascribed approach. There was a letter written by the famed Rabbeinu Tam. So Rabbeinu Tam was the grandson of Rashi and one of the founders of the school of the Bali Tosfos in North France and Germany. And he wrote a letter against Rabbi Yosef of Orleans. Rabbi Yosef of Orleans used the traditional version of the get, and Rabbeinu Tam thought there were problems with this traditional version, and Rabbi Yosef defended himself and said, look, I'm following the Minhag. And in a very famous comment, Rabbeinu Tam responded to him and said, the letters of the word Minhag are identical to the word Gehinnom, hell, and Minhagim can be the path to Gehinnom, to hell. So responded Rabbeinu Tam, clearly indicating a mindset, so it is said, in which he is somewhat more open to diverting Minhagim and taking a different approach to Minhag than perhaps other authorities. And this is often held up in contrast to perhaps the approach of Rav Hagadol. Rav Hagadol wrote a very famous letter dealing with the issue of the blasts of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. And Rav Hagadol wrote in this letter, and he said, I don't understand your whole research that you've conducted and your great effort that you've gone into trying to determine the nature of the blasts. There's a clear minhag around this matter. Go to shul and you will hear how people blow. This is a halacha that's holechet or peshutah b'chol Yisrael. It's spread throughout the Jewish people. And since this is our practice, there's nothing else further to talk about. He says this is like a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. This is the tradition that we've inherited, and this is the source of halachic authority. In fact, he makes an interesting point, Rabbeinu Tam, and he says, what is it that establishes for us the authority of the Mishnah and the Gemara, and in some respects, even the written Torah? And he says it's tradition, it's Hamasorah, it's that which has been handed down through the generations, from parent to child, which gives us access to these classic works. And therefore there's something perverse, something disproportionate and imbalanced about arguing that we can dismiss a minhag or question a minhag on the basis of the classic texts, when the whole basis of their authority is that of tradition and Masorah that's been handed down, and therefore minhag is trumped. Minhag is the ultimate source of authority. And this is sometimes presented as if this is a different mindset or way of thinking between Rabbeinu Tam, who was a great innovator. No doubt he innovated the classical, by now classical system of reasoning of the Tosfos with very critical analysis. The Ashkenazim of that generation engaged in research and manuscripts and a whole new way of thinking. And Rabbeinu Tam is this innovative thinker, and Hagadol is representing the tradition. But this is an overly narrow summary of the situation. The very famous phrase, Minhag Yisrael Torah, the tradition of Yisrael is Torah, is actually one of the earliest sources for this quote. Is found in Rabbeinu Tam himself. In his Sefer HaYashar, one of his halachic works, Rabbeinu Tam quotes this phrase, Minhag Yisrael Torah, and it's one of the earliest references we find to this classic phrase, Minhag Yisrael Torah, that the Minhag of Yisrael has the authority of Torah. So the idea that Rabbeinu Tam had this sort of monochromatic, or one can simplify these issues with catchphrases, is certainly not so clear-cut. The earliest reference I could find to this phrase, Minhag Yisrael Torah, actually arises in the world of Ashkenaz, in the teachers of Rashi, the generation above Rashi, about whom we know relatively little. And in their phrase, they use this is a figure called Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Yehuda, a teacher of Rashi, and he says, Minhag Torah, Minhag is the authority of Torah. So at the time, the very innovative world of Ashkenaz was also using this phrase. So there isn't a simplistic way to summarize the approach of the classic authorities on the matter. And the reason I think is partly because actually there are many sorts of minhagim, each of which needs to be understood in its own context. And one could really give a share on each of these categories of minhagim. But I want to just try and give a sample of the different sorts of minhag, and for each one, think about what the source of authority is for this particular minhag, why we need to listen to it. Now, the first example of minhag is where minhag is really the source of Masorah or tradition, meaning to say it's not innovating anything whatsoever, it's simply a way of transmitting halachic pasuk. So we know, for example, there are areas of tradition which became lost over the generations, and sometimes whilst the schools of academia, the Bati Medrash and the yeshivas, lost a tradition as to how a halacha should be carried out, the common folk, the people who were living with these ways of behaving, carried the halacha in their hands. And this is one way in which minhag is used. It's not a minhag in the sense of innovation or originating practice. It's simply carrying tradition with it. And there's a classic Gemara around the subject with a link to Pesach and this time of year in particular, in which the Gemara brings that there was the leaders, this is Gemara in Pesachim in Samach Vov Amud Aleph, and the Gemara says that the leaders of the Jewish world at the time were the Bnei Beseira. There were sons of Beseira. It's not clear if this refers to the sons of a particular father or residents of a particular location, but there was a co-leadership of the Jewish people. And one year, Erev Pesach fell on Shabbos, as per this year. And they were unsure what to do. Is the Carbon Pesach brought on Shabbos? Is the Carbon Pesach not brought on Shabbos? And Hillel, who was on origin a Bavli, a Babylonian, and a newcomer to the scene in the land of Israel, he paskened this question, and in an act of incredible modesty, the Bnei Beseira stepped down from their leadership and handed over the leadership of the Jewish people to Hillel. And of course, the leadership remained in the royal family of the Nossi of Hillel for 15 generations or more. So this is a Gemara in Pesachim, but there's an interesting continuation to the Gemara, in which Hillel was then asked a question about how do we bring the sacrifice of the Pesach on the Shabbos? How do we carry the knives needed for the Shechita? And to this, the response was, I don't know. Hillel didn't know how it was done. And he said to them, what should we do? Hillel responded, Shamati v'shachachti. I learned this halach from my teachers and I've forgotten. Elahanoch lehen Yisrael. Leave it up to the Jewish people. Let's see what they do. If they are not prophets, they are the children of prophets. And the Gemara carries on that indeed the scholars of the Beis HaMedrash of the Yeshiva watched the next day to see what the people did. And the people came flocking to Yerushalayim, the sheep covering the local hillsides like snow, and they stuck the shechita knives into the wool of the sheep. So the sheep was carrying the knife rather than the people. And this is how they managed to carry it. So they stuck it between the horns and they got the animal to carry the shechita knife rather than the people themselves. And in that particular context, this was what to do. So this is a classic Gemara in which the Gemara ascribes, or classic source rather, Minhagim, in which the Gemara ascribes authority over tradition, not only to the people in the Beis HaMedrash, the Rosh Yeshiva, the sages, but rather to the common folk who carry traditions with them. And the Gemara subscribes, perhaps metaphorically, perhaps literally, almost a quasi-prophetic ability in which they are called, they're not prophets, prophecy has ceased, but they are Bnei Nevi'im. They have a holy intuition of sorts as to know how to behave. Now, whether this was an intuition of Pesach or people just remembered how they had done in previous years when Pesach had fallen, Erev Pesach had fallen on a Shabbos, be that as it may, Minhag as a source of carrying tradition is one context in which this phrase is used. Now for this, we don't need, in a sense, to go any further. In truth, the authority behind the Minhag is the original Torah or rabbinic law, and the Minhag is simply a way in which it's been transmitted not through the traditions of the yeshiva, but through the traditions of the people. And this has entered into the halachic system in a very powerful way. The Talmud Yerushalmi says a statement which was quoted ever after by the poskim, kol halacha shehi refefes, based in any halacha which is unclear, the einati yodea mativa, one doesn't know how to behave, see how the community practices v'noig, and then follow that practice. And this is quoted, as I said, by many later authorities. Minhag as a determinant of what correct practice is one type of minhag, and in a sense that is self-explanatory. We don't need a source for the authority of minhag because it is simply another vehicle through which oral tradition can be carried, and on occasion a more reliable tradition than that of the yeshiva or the Beis HaMedrash. Now we also find minhag paskening between different views. So in this particular case, Hillel couldn't remember the halacha, and he saw what the people did. But in other cases, the halacha is a machlokas, is an argument, and people vote with their feet how to pasken. They vote with their feet how to follow. And in that sense, minhag determines halacha. This is a little more interesting. Here, people are not carrying the practice, but they are determining halacha. But once again, in essence, the authority doesn't lie in the practice itself. The authority lies in the initial halacha. The minhag isn't innovating a practice. It's simply finding a way to apply the practice when it is subject of debate. And therefore, in a sense, it's an application of the general rules of Pesach. So whilst we are more used to thinking of, for example, achrei rabim lahatos, following the majority in a debate as being in the context of a beis din, it would seem that the communal vote in a halachic debate is also one of significance. And in essence, as pointed out by the Rivash, this is how a halachic system works. So what gives authority to a great posek, a leading halachic authority, a Moshe Feinstein of the world, is the fact that many lesser authorities, communal rabbonim and the like, turn to Moshe and consider his reasoning to be authoritative and convincing. And communities in turn elect their rabbinic leadership. And in this sense, this is a communal approach to deciding halacha and practice, in which minhag determines how we pasken and which viewpoint, when it is subject of debate, is decided like. And there are fascinating examples of how minhag weaves its way through halachic debate, sometimes in manners which are clear-cut and sometimes in manners which are less clear-cut. I just want to share one example with you. Part of this example, I think, is quite well known, and the other part of the example is less well known. Now, there is a Gemara in Menachos in which the Gemara states that a mezuzah should be positioned like a bolt. And I'm not going to go into the technical details of the Gemara, other than Rashi was convinced that this meant that the mezuzah should be attached vertically, and Rabbeinu Tam is convinced that the mezuzah should be attached horizontally. So a mezuzah should be attached vertically as per Rashi, or horizontally as per Rabbeinu Tam. The Rambam and Sfardim in general pasken like the view of Rashi, and they put their mezuzahs straight up. Ashkenazim adopt a compromise position, and a fascinating one at that, in which they position the mezuzah at an angle. So Ashkenazi minhag developed, in which it saw a debate between two of its foremost authorities, Rashi, the great Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam, the founder of the Tosafist school of thought, and it adopted a compromise in which it's at an angle in order for it both to be, in a sense, pointing upwards like Rashi, and also in a sense horizontal like Rabbeinu Tam. And this became the universal practice with mezuzahs. Now, minhagim are not always entirely consistent in how they adapt. Is this actually a good compromise? Well, perhaps yes. Perhaps it's a good way of fulfilling both the view of Rashi and the view of Rabbeinu Tam, or perhaps not. Arguably, it's fulfilling neither position, because the mezuzah is neither horizontal nor vertical. But be that as it may, the collective practice of Ashkenazi Jewry navigated a way between these two opinions, and thus arose the minhag. Less well known is that we have the same compromise when it comes to Sifrei Torah. Because in fact, the machlokas, the argument between Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi is not just over mezuzahs, but is over all sacred texts. Rabbeinu Tam believes they should lie down, and Rashi believes and Rambam believes they should be standing up, they should be vertical. And therefore, Sephardi Sifrei Torah are read vertical, standing up, whereas Ashkenazi Sifrei Torah are read at an angle on the bimah. And it is for this reason that our bimahs are angled, and it's for this reason that Sifrei Torah are placed in the Aron HaKodesh at an angle, as opposed to the Sephardi design of the Sefer Torah, in which it's in a casket of its own, such that it is both read and stored in the Aron HaKodesh, standing up. So there we see a consistency of practice. By the way, there is one Ashkenazi shul in the world, to the best of my knowledge, in which this practice is not kept. And this is the Belz shul, the Great Belz synagogue in Yerushalayim, the vast palatial shul. The minhag of the Rebbes of Belz, for mystical reasons, which I'm not going to go into now, is to paskin like Rabbeinu Tam for themselves. And there the Sifrei Torah are placed lying down in the Aron HaKodesh. Very fascinating. If you're ever in Yerushalayim and you have the chance to visit the Belz shul, have a look inside the Aron HaKodesh, and you will see the Sifrei Torah lying down. So we have Belz with the Sifrei Torah lying down, the Sephardi world with vertical Sifrei Torah, and Ashkenazi practice in which it's compromised, in which we do it at an angle. Tefillin, according to Rabbeinu Tam, also should be lying down, horizontally placed. The parchment inside the box of the tefillin, the little scrolls inside the box of the tefillin should be lying down. In practice, no one does this. The Rabbeinu Tam tefillin that some people wear is following a different view of Rabbeinu Tam, but no one puts the tefillin inside the boxes lying down. Again, an example in which Minhag has navigated between Pesach, though not always in a consistent manner. As a side note, by the way, the tefillin, there's been a lot of talk in the news recently about new discovery of Dead Sea Scrolls. The original discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Qumran excavations, they actually found tefillin arranged like Rabbeinu Tam, in which when you open the tefillin box, one sees the little parchment slips or scrolls horizontally placed rather than vertically placed. Though as to whether Qumran represents an orthodox or heterodox perspective is another discussion, and therefore this isn't granted particular halachic weight. One certainly sees that this debate goes back at least 1,000 years before Rabbeinu Tam. So this is another example of minhag, in which minhag is either transmitting tradition, or minhag is paskening between disputing viewpoints, or perhaps trying to find a compromise position which achieves perhaps both stances and negotiates a way to avoid getting caught up in conflict, such as by placing the mezuzah of Sefer Torah at an angle. So in answer to our question, what is the authority of minhag? What is the place of minhag? When we mean by minhag a transmission of tradition or a pasak between arguing viewpoints, in essence, what we are saying is that minhag doesn't have its own authority. It's a way of clarifying a core Torah idea. Tefillin, mezuzahs, how to carry the knife, how to bring the carbon Pesach from the Shabbat, which is an Erev Pesach. These aren't minhag matters, these are in essence halachic matters, and the minhag simply navigates and carries a pasak or tradition between them. But what about when we're dealing with minhag which is genuinely innovative? What about when we're dealing with minhag in which the minhag has authority of its own and is creating halachic practice in its own right? So this is where we move on to the second sort of minhag, where minhag seems to create its own halachic legislation. Now, the core text that we need to look at over here is a text around rabbinic authority, a text around the authority of rabbinic rulings in general. And I'm going to share my screen for a few moments, and we'll look at a text that on the Sunday morning we spent a long time looking at, and we're just going to look at it very briefly today. And the text says as follows. This is a pasuk in Devarim, a set of pasukim in Devarim, the 17th chapter of Devarim. Pasuk says, 8 says, Ki yipolei mimcha davar lemishpat. When a matter eludes you in judgment, there's a matter of law, of halacha, which is unclear. being dam nadam, being din nadin, whether it's a matter referring to blood or judgment, or nega lenega, matters of suras, divrei rivos, whether it's a matter of human relationships or a monetary law. One should ascend to the place chosen by God, ascend to Yerushalayim, which is by tradition the seat of the Sanhedrin. We look in Pasuk Yud, in Pasuk 10, and it says, you should do according to the word they tell you. So one should follow the ruling issued from that place. Pasuk Yud Aleph, Pasuk 11. You should follow what they do. Do not veer off the instructions that have been given to you, either right or left. Now, I'm not going to go into an extensive analysis of this pasuk, other than to say this pasuk tells us that certainly when a matter is unclear and it needs resolution, one should turn to the central halachic authority of the day. Now, there's much that is unclear as to the meaning of this pasuk. Is it referring to a particular central authority, like the Sanhedrin, or could it include expanded authorities, each community and rabbinic leadership of each community? This is something we discussed extensively in my series on Torah Sheba'al Peh and on Das Torah. But suffice it to say for now that there are different perspectives on the matter. But the fact is, it is clear from halachic sources that even when there is no centralized authority, no Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, rabbinic leadership in each locale, in each location, can issue its own pasak. And this is the source of localized rabbinic pasak. The Chinuch says this is necessary in any legal system. You don't have everyone interpreting complex laws by themselves. People need guidance as to how to behave. There has to be some court of last appeal, somewhere to turn to know in practice what to do. And this is the authority granted to poskim in order to decide halacha. So this is the source of halachic ruling. The Rambam, by the way, discusses the history of this. And this is really the source of halachic divide in its most famous iteration between the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi world, and perhaps the Eidat HaMizrach also. And here I'll just briefly digress to a bit of history, something I think I shared with the community many years ago, but I'll just summarize again. If one was a Jew living in around the year 900, living in North Africa, in Italy, in Spain, in France, or Germany, there was little Torah scholarship found in any of these locations. If one was unclear as to how to paskin, what to do, one would send a letter to the yeshivas in Bavel, headed by the Gaonim, the illustrious leaders of the yeshivas there. And with the wonders of communication in a global village, 6 months later, a letter would come back with a pasak issued as to what to do. Now, if your question was around the kashrus of a chicken, the response would come back too late. But if your question was around what is the correct nusach hatfilah, the correct way of davening, then the pasak would come back and the local community would have its siddur. And we know from the Cairo Geniza and the like that this is how texts developed in these far-flung corners of the Jewish world, extensive communication backwards and forwards between the different corners of the Jewish world. This is until the year 900. Fast forward 100 years, the year 1000, and there's a flourishing of Torah learning in each of these locations. There are learned Jewish communities in North Africa, in France, in Germany, in Italy, and still a learned community in the Middle East, but no longer one that is superior and senior to all other communities, but equal to all the others. So in a space of about 100 years, the Jewish world went from a centralized authority in Bavel, which had been the center of Jewish learning for 1,000 years before, and where the Talmud Bavli, the most authoritative text until then, had been written, and from where the Gaonim sent rulings out to the whole Jewish world, to 100 years later, very confident, powerful Torah centers in North France, in Germany, in Italy, in North Africa, in Spain. A remarkable change in Jewish history, and one that to this day we still don't know how to understand. The parable to think about this is, Imagine in 1,000 years' time if people were studying the Torah centers of the Jewish world in the 1900s, and they observed that in the year 1900, the main Torah center of the Jewish world was in East Europe, with smaller Torah centers in North Africa. 100 years later, in the year 2000, the two main Torah centers of the world are Israel and North America. And imagine they didn't know why this change happened in 100 years. That would be the extent of the mystery that we confront when we look back 1,000 years ago to this change. Very mysterious change in Jewish history. There was no big event that we know of, the equivalent of the catastrophic relocation of Jews from East Europe and North Africa to Israel, to America, and so on. So we don't know why this change happened 1,000 years ago, in which suddenly Bovel declined and all these other Torah centers sprung up, but the fact is they did. And the key difference is that these were now localized authorities as opposed to central authorities. And suddenly you had Pesach emerging locally in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, in North Africa, in the Middle East. And from this derives the various Minhagim that we have to this day. So this is an application of the Halacha, which says turn to a central rabbinic authority, already dating back, as we said, to the Pasuk in Devarim, in the 17th chapter of Devarim, in which law is determined by rabbinic Pesach, but now diffused and scattered throughout the Jewish world. And this is the second sense in which we mean minhag, the authority granted, interpretive, not yet innovative, interpretive authority to explain and explicate and understand halacha, but now scattered through different locations in the Jewish world, such that we talk about Minhag Ashkenaz and Minhag Sephard. But what we really mean by that is Pesach issued by local rabbinic authority, which differs in different locations. So this is the second sense of minhag. The first sense of minhag was carrying tradition with it, and perhaps unified authoritative decisions between different viewpoints. And the second sense of minhag is when the way of practicing differs between how different rabbinic leaders are paskined, and because they are in their locale, in the area, therefore different minhag develops. So this is the second sense of minhag. It is again not a source of its own authority. When we refer to something as Minhag Ashkenaz or Minhag Sephard, we simply mean the localized Pesach in these great Torah centers and the reading and reasoning and Pesach of the leadership in these locations. However, at this point, we now hit the third meaning of minhag, which is the ability of minhag to innovate, to create something new. Because the Rambam, controversially, reads this pasuk granting rabbinic authority, not just to interpretation, but also to innovation. And the Rambam says that there is a rabbinic right, not just to interpret, but also to innovate based upon these pasukim that we have just read. And interestingly, when he talks about innovation, creating new halacha based upon this pasuk, he doesn't just mean legislation, rabbinic legislation, which we're used to, which we refer to as drabonon, as rabbinic legislation, but he also mentions minhag. So let's learn for a couple of minutes a piece of Rambam again, and I will share the screen just to have a look at this Rambam. And the Rambam here, is in, the Rambam here is in Hilchos Mamrim. Hilchos Mamrim is the laws of rebels. It's the laws of the authority of the courts, and when someone can engage in conscientious objection and refuse to accept the authority, a topic for another time. And the Rambam in Halacha 1 says that the Supreme Court in Jerusalem is the place of interpretation of Torah. But then in Halacha 2, he says, we are also obligated to listen to rabbinic innovation, rabbinic legislation, matters which they introduced to safeguard the Torah, or that was necessary at a specific time. And he says, if we look in Halacha 2, I've split them up into A, B, and C, so we'll just look at C in Halacha 2. They instituted the matters of safeguard for the Torah as necessary at the time. And he says these are the decrees, edicts, and customs. Or if we look in the Hebrew, echod devorim she'osar l'siyog the Torah, whether these are matters which were made as a barrier or boundary for the Torah, all that time's needed. The hein hagazeros, these are the legislations, the takonos, the edicts, the haminhagos, and the minhag that was introduced. So the Rambam here, in the source that we've just looked at, says that rabbinic authority extends not just to specific legislation, but also to innovation, and not just to innovation created rabbinically, but also to innovation created by the people, minhag, that developed. Now, it's not clear exactly what the Rambam means when he talks here about minhag. What type of minhag are we talking about that has legislative authority? Is the point that makes it minhag, custom, practice, as opposed to a strict drabonon, because it's local as opposed to universal? Or is the point because it develops from a local practice and then is authorized by the rabbinic leadership? Is this some form of people-generated practice in which the rabbinic leadership then catches up and accepts it? This matter isn't entirely clear. We have a clue in the writing of the Rif. The Rif, who lived in the 11th century in North Africa, Rabbi Yitzchak al-Fassi, who was a teacher of the Rambam, and therefore was part of the same tradition from which the Rambam emerges, speaks about minhag developing, initiated by people, by lay leadership, who would approach the rabbinic leadership and say, we think this is a matter that needs to be addressed. And they would consult with the elders of the community, he says, and they would create legislation. And this is minhag. So it seems to be that the Rambam here has a model in which there are two routes to generate rabbinic legislation: a top-down approach, which is the rabbinic leadership, and a bottom-up approach, which is the people as a whole adopting a certain practice and maintaining that this is an important way of keeping or applying halacha. And the Rambam labels this minhag, and in his Mishnah Torah and his halachic work, he says these minhagim have the force of rabbinic law. Nonetheless, we don't make brachas on such practices. And here we get to the really interesting point. What was the Rambam thinking here? Why did the Rambam think that a mass movement of halachic practice should have halachic weight in order to establish a minhag without it being imposed, and in the Rambam's view, included in the authority granted to the centralized body, the Sanhedrin, which is allowed to create legislation. And one way of understanding this is the view of the Rambam that the Sanhedrin have the role of the representative of the whole people. They're not just the Beis Din, but they are also the representatives of the people, the executive for the people. This is an idea expanded upon by the famed Rabbi Chaim Brisker, who therefore argues that if the authority of the Sanhedrin derives from the people, then how much more so, Kal v'chomer, the people themselves carry within them halachic authority. So the Beis Din, the centralized authority, derives its legislative ability, its ability to innovate, from being the central authority of the people. But how much more so can the people themselves give rise to such pasak? And therefore the Rambam was of the opinion that minhag established by the people en masse and approved of, yes, definitely approved of by rabbinic leadership, in other words, seen as being in line with halacha, would have authority in its own right. And minhag has this innovative ability in its essence. I don't want to talk about this at too much length, but the Rambam is of the view that the classic semicha, the classic rabbinic authority handed down from generation to generation and lost in the times of the Romans, can be reestablished by the decision of the shared leadership of the Jewish people. And there were various attempts in the 1500s in Tzafat and in the early 1950s in modern-day Israel to reestablish this authority based upon consensuses of the people. You may not be surprised to learn that all these attempts failed because unified decisions on these matters was not possible. So this is the view of the Rambam, that minhag has the authority of rabbinic status, though what exactly the Rambam means by this minhag, and which minhagim would cross the threshold to get the status of such halachic authority, remains a little unclear. Does the Rambam believe it has to be cross-national, or can it even be localized? And does it need is the difference that it arises from the people as opposed to bottom down from the authority of the Rabbanim? Now, in this category would fall a wide-ranging spectrum of minhagim. The Gemara tells us, for example, refers to something, and this is how the Rambam paskins also, which it calls minhag hanavim, the practice of the Nevi'im. So it would appear that even in the times of the Nevi'im, there were practices which were adopted by the people and or the Nevi'im, which they instituted as minhag rather than as legislation. And an example of this is the practice of Hoshanos, of hitting the Hoshanos and Purim, which I referenced previously. But possibly another example of this would be the issue of kitnius around Pesach. I don't want to go into all the details of kitnius, this isn't the forum for this, but the brief history of kitnius is that it arose, it's first mentioned, written down in the early 13th century in the Ashkenazi world, in South France, Provence in particular, and the way it's written, it sounds like already at that stage, it was an ancient custom. So it's definitely an old minhag, and it would appear to have the structure of a gzeira, a fence built around the Torah. So it would appear to have the structure of a gzeira, a fence built around the Torah, and this was granted in the Ashkenazi world the full force of rabbinic legislation. Now, I don't know why kitnius has become the least popular minhag in the Jewish canon. It's not seemingly so difficult to avoid kitnius over the 8 days of Pesach, but for some reason it's become a particularly unpopular minhag. And in halachic terms, this is very difficult to deal with, because in halachic terms, this is something taken very seriously by the poskim, in which it's treated as rabbinic legislation because of the power of minhag, as we've seen, to create isurei d'Rabbanan. Now, how are we meant to understand the authority of rabbinic legislation or minhag in this context? And there's 3 or 4 ways of understanding it. One way of understanding it is that it reveals an underlying reasonableness. In other words, in the case of kitnius, for example, there's reason to worry about kitnius becoming confused with other grains. The production process of kitnius involves other grains, and incidentally, this is not something that has changed in the modern times. This is exactly the same. These are similar to other grains and stored with other grains and generally processed in the same sorts of processing units. And therefore, the reasonableness behind the minhag would remain. And the authority granted to minhag in this case would be the underlying svara or reasonableness behind it. A second way of understanding it is that this is some form of social contract or social covenant. In fact, when we ask ourselves about the authority of Torah itself, it is clear when we learn the Torah that the nature of acceptance of the Torah is through the mechanism of a covenant, a bris. The whole Torah is referred to as a sefer bris, and again, the Jewish people enter into a bris or a treaty or a covenant with Hashem. And when we look in detail at the nature of this covenant, it would appear that the covenant, and so the Gemara understands it, isn't just a relationship between man and God, but it's also a covenantal relationship, or we would call it nowadays perhaps a social contract, between the people as a whole. And therefore the authority of rabbinic law, and according to the Rambam, the authority of minhag itself, may well derive from a social contract of sorts. We're aware of the concept of social contract in halacha. I spoke a few months back about the concept of dinah, the malchus of dinah, the law of the land being the law. And according to the Rashbam and many other authorities, the basis of this is a social contract. You're part of a society and therefore accept the rules of the society. And it may well be that this is also the authority of Minhag and perhaps even Drabonon in general, in which there is a bris, a covenant of sorts entered into by Klal Yisrael, in which we didn't just accept the authority of Torah Shebechsav or God-given Torah, but we also accepted the authority of rabbinic legislation. Again, so argues Reb Chaim Soloveitchik Brisker in a analysis around this topic. I want now to talk, though, about localized minhagim, which don't have the authority of halacha in the strictest sense, and nonetheless carry halachic weight to a degree. So to summarize what we've said so far, we spoke about minhag, which isn't innovative at all, really. It's simply a way of carrying tradition about halacha, which really is Torah force law. We spoke about minhag as a way of determining law. When there's debate between different schools of thought, it's a way of paskening, in which in a sense, minhag again isn't innovative. It's simply determining different opinions and perhaps carrying the tradition of localized pasak. But then we moved on to minhag, which is genuinely innovative. It genuinely is creative. Kitnius being an example of this, a minhag which arose at some time in history. By the 13th century, it's already an ancient minhag, but one which is localized to South France and then works its way up into Northern Europe and the whole of the Ashkenazi world. And genuinely is innovating something which didn't exist previously. So from what does that derive its halachic authority? And the answer we saw in the formulation of the Rambam is that this is another type of Drabanon. Drabanon can be directly legislated, in which case we refer to it as rabbinic law, or it can be a minhag, which is a practice that was introduced. How is this practice introduced? The Rambam doesn't make it clear. Is it rabbinically led, or as per the Rif, is it lay leadership led, or does it emerge from the common practice of the people who feel something is appropriate? Did people begin avoiding kitnios because they were worried about it in this example, and therefore was it a people-led initiative, or was it a rabbinic-led initiative? Not entirely clear in the Rambam, but the Rambam believes this has the force of rabbinic law, and remarkably grounds it in the same pasuk which tells us about the authority of the Sanhedrin and the authority of rabbinic leadership to legislate. And this is the pasuk of lo soso, of don't deviate from that which is decreed. And the Rambam believes this has the weight of divine sanction, the love, the negative prohibition, the positive prohibition of centralized rabbinic authority. Those that argue with the Rambam and don't go quite that far would still adopt a model in which it has authority, whether because it is revealing a sensible way of behaving, or whether because of some form of social contract, perhaps in essence not dissimilar to the bris and the covenant which the Jewish people entered into in terms of their relationship to God. Finally, there are a number of other halachic sources referenced by the Gemara around these topics, and I just want to mention several of them for the sake of completion. The first is a Gemara in Pesachim, which records the practice of a group of people called the Bnei Baishon. Now, it is not clear if Bnei Baishon, the sons of Baishon, refers to residents of an area or a village called Baishon, or a family who are descendants of a man called Baishon. So it's not clear what this term refers to, but they had to practice not to travel on Fridays. And the Gemara in Pesachim records that they were obligated in this practice based upon the pasuk of Shema B'ni Musa Avicha, V'al Titosh Torah Samecha, a pasuk in Mishli, in the first chapter of Mishli. Listen, my child, to the rebuke or the guidance of your father, and do not desert the Torah of your mother, seeming to indicate that there is a personalized Torah that one can receive from family inheritance. So this is the Gemara in Pesachim, which speaks about family tradition carrying halachic weight. We're not talking here about strict halacha like minhag that we've spoken about till now, but family tradition having weight because of the Shema B'ni Musa Avicha, the connection to previous generations. The Talmud Yerushalmi brings a similar story about a similar practice not to travel on Fridays. And the Yerushalmi says the source of authority for family practice or localized practice is the idea of a neder, a promise or an oath. So we are aware that in the Pasuk teaches us that people can take upon themselves nedorim, they can create commitments of practice. So I can make an oath, a promise that I will give a certain sum of money to charity, and I will keep halacha in a certain way. And the Yerushalmi seems to be of the view that a community or a family can accept such a commitment on itself in a manner of a corporate body, such that it will be a commitment for future generations too. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. If a company, a corporate body, a company, engages in a contract, and over the next 50 years, all the shareholders in that company have exchanged shares, and 50 years later, all the owners of the company do not own it at the time it entered the contract 50 years ago, nonetheless, they would be obligated in their commitment because the company behaves as a corporate entity having its own commitment. Or similarly with a country. A country enters a treaty 300 years ago. No one is alive now, 300 years later was alive then, but as citizens of the country, we all have this corporate commitment. And the Yerushalmi argues there's such a concept of a neder, a commitment taken on by a family as a vow of sorts, which binds anyone who is connected to that family or to that area, that locale, now bounded by the force of this minhag. Now, in the same way as one can move country or leave the corporate body of a company or citizenship and then cease to have these commitments, the same would apply to minhag. And this is the concept of moving from location to location. So it is a historical fact that individuals who moved from country to country changed their minhag to adopt the minhag in the new location. So a Sephardi, a Spanish refugee from Spain, who made his way up, as many did, to East Europe, effectively became an East European Jew in their practice. And now East European Jews with surnames like Portugal and Emmanuel and Donchia and the like, who are East European practicing Jews, Yiddish-speaking Jews, who descend from Spanish communities, who have shifted their membership of the corporate unit, which became known as Spanish or Sephardi Jewry, and therefore have adopted the practice of Ashkenazim. And the trend went in reverse also. So, for example, the famed Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, a descendant of the famous Ashkenazi family, the Luria family, was orphaned and brought up by his uncle in Egypt and adopted Egyptian and ultimately Middle Eastern practice in his Minhagim. So this is a third model of identity, the neder model, in which a communal commitment is binding on anyone who remains part of that community. If someone would leave all Ashkenazi practices and adopt fully Sephardi practices, then indeed they could perhaps shift their identity with the community, but until that point they are bound by communal practice by the force of neder, the force of a promise that's made. Incidentally, a very common feature of life may be connected to this, and this is the idea of a wife taking on their husband's minhagim. Now, there seem to be three halachic rationales for the idea of wives adopting husbands' minhagim, and I'm not going to go now into the issue of whether it can work the other way around and whether in contemporary society this can be applied differently, but certainly the concept of switching family. When someone joins a new family, they would now no longer be bound by the family commitment that was made, and therefore would effectively have moved location. And in the same way someone has moved location and left one community, joins a second community, similarly someone who enters into marriage and now joins a new family unit switches their minhag to now belong to the new family unit. And this is a second model of what minhag is about. There is a remarkable source, and with this I will conclude the sources that I'm looking at over here, and which was made famous by the Torah Tamima, but actually derives its origin from Rav Shri Ragan. And Rav Shri Ragan seems to cite an earlier source which translates the very famous pasuk in Devarim 19. And the pasuk there says, Lo sasig gevul re'acha asher govru rishonim. Do not transgress or move the boundary which the early ones set. And this is normally taken to mean, don't move fences. If you have a fence between your field and your neighbor's field, lo sasig gevul, don't move the fence into their land to expand your territory. It's also used hasagas gevul as a title for the competition laws in halacha, the laws around which, if someone has the monopoly on a particular business, whether I'm allowed to step in and break their monopoly, is referred to as hasagas gevul. But Rav Shrir Gon understands this pasuk to mean don't break the boundaries of your friends, of your community, when boundaries were established as minhag through the generations. And this is another source for the authority of minhag, which Rav Shrir Gon seems to have understood is a translation of a pasuk. So what do we conclude with all of this? Well, firstly, minhag means lots of different things. And in each case, we need to understand what we mean by minhag. Secondly, the importance of minhag. Minhag has significant halachic weight, and it's not something just to be dismissed. Sometimes it reflects an interpretation of Torah law, rabbinic law. Sometimes it's innovative and is a creation of halacha in its own right, but certainly it always has some significance. Thirdly, the significance will vary depending on the nature of the minhag. And in my responses to Shilas on many occasions around Pesach, I answer that there is a general minhag, for example, to buy all products with a hechsher. Nonetheless, the core halacha is, and then I will say whether this particular artifact needs a hechsher or not. And the reason I phrase it that way is to try and achieve a balance. Because on the one hand, minhag is important, and there is good rationale why the minhag is for all products to be bought with a hechsher. If one hears one year that, well, black coffee doesn't need a hechsher, but flavored coffee does, and decaffeinated coffee does, or you hear that tea doesn't need a hechsher, but you need to check whether the tea bag is made with a new technology in which the tea bag is made from a starch-based material, an old technology which is paper-based, this becomes confusing. And there's no doubt that if as a community as a whole, we start buying products without hechsherim over Pesach, there will be mistakes made and slippage that occurs. So there's sound basis to the reason that developed, the minhag that developed from the 1500s on, when food began being sold commercially on a large level, to insist on a minhag for Pesach. On the other hand, people find themselves in different situations. People have to make their own decisions depending on their family circumstances, their financial circumstances, and therefore I feel it's appropriate to always say what the core halacha is also. So this is an attempt to find the balancing between a minhag, which in this case is not a minhag which has absolute halachic authority. There's no halachic requirement to buy everything with a hechsher. This isn't a minhag which has been accepted universally or has achieved halachic status, but nonetheless certainly makes a lot of sense and is reasonable to keep to. On the other hand, has to be balanced with an understanding, a depth of understanding of what the core halacha is and an ability to make people's lives manageable. But I think more importantly than that, we have to see minhagim as an application of innovation, as an application of people-centered spirituality. Minhag is the tool to which Klal Yisrael developed an application of halacha to their own unique circumstances. And here I want to start off to conclude with that which I started off with. When we left Egypt, Chazal tell us, the merit we had was because lo shinu shemam malbusham and lashonim. They didn't change their language, their name and their clothing. None of these are halachic matters, but it kept and preserved Klal Yisrael as an identity, as a unit. And therefore, even though, as we say in the Hagadol, they were naked and bare of mitzvahs, they nonetheless still had a peoplehood about them, which allowed them to achieve, to be a body which could leave Yetzias Mitzrayim, could leave Egypt. And there's no doubt that Yiddishkeit, Judaism, has to be more than just halacha. It has to be an immersive experience, which includes a culture, which includes a way of life. It's legitimate that we have our own music, our own hobbies, our own way of speaking, what we enjoy, how we dress, our sense of humor. Because Judaism is more than just a halachic system. Minhag is essential to defining what it means, not just to keep halacha as a legal system, but to be immersed in a certain way of life. And I think there's a beauty in a pride in family origins and history, a connection to previous generations. For children to know, I come from a tradition which is 1,000 years old, in which my ancestors lived in North Africa, or in West Europe, or in East Europe, or in the Middle East. And this is how our family does this. We have our tunes for the Zemiras, and we have our ways of davening, and our ways of keeping halacha. And we don't need to see this as a source of division and divisiveness in Klal Yisrael, but part of the range that creates the beautiful pattern, the quilt, the multicolored quilt, which is what the Jewish people are meant to be. So minhag certainly has halachic significance. How much halachic significance depends on each minhag and which category it falls in. There are cases where minhag is the road to Gehinnom. As Rabbi Natan taught us, cases where minhag and Gehinnom, the same letters, can create friction, can create tension. It can be a minhag toros, a mistaken minhag, or a minhag that rips families apart because of an imbalanced application of it. So it needs sensitive balance to work out how to apply it. But equally, minhag is part of the richness that we have inherited from our ancestors, part of the essence of the Jewish experience, and certainly something that shouldn't be discarded, but should be taken with the utmost seriousness. And as I said, in certain cases, has the full force of halacha. So I will conclude there with what I wanted to say. I see there's a number of questions on the WhatsApp groups, and I'm happy to take them. I'm also happy to take further questions if any are asked, if anyone wants to ask afterwards. So I think I've dealt with most of them. So